Hello everybody, thanks for coming today. I think everybody knows your tickets went to the James Beard Foundation. It's great that we can donate our time and efforts to the James Beard Foundation. They do wonders for the culinary, wine, food business, so I thank you all for that. We have a great event tonight. I'm the host of Eat, Drink, Italy. It's a very, very hard job, but someone has to do it. And I was chosen to do that. I eat, drink Italy, so I get to go to Italy about 8 times a year. Our show is on WNET, is our sponsor station, public television. We aired on about 70% of the country. This year, second season in July, we'll be on Create TV. We're going to be the first show to premiere on Create TV, and we'll be in 90% of the households in the United States. Tony Berdoni told me that something like 257 million people could potentially watch our show. So that's good news for the show in Italy. Okay, so apparently everybody likes to eat, drink Italy, so I had the opportunity to be here today with one of the great winemakers of Italy, Axel Heinz. Today you're drinking his wines, and he's going to tell you about them when he joins me up here. And Tony Berdoni, I'm a little biased, but I say he's the most knowledgeable. Okay, on the table in front of you, there's a tasting mat with the name of the 2 wines that you're drinking. Mentor, and Tony is with me on the show in any of the wine segments that we do. So if you see the show and you see a guy that looks like Scorsese, it's not Scorsese. But he'll take, right, because you say Scorsese sometimes.
Is he talking to me?
Yes. Okay, so we're going to get started. And for the first thing that we prepared, we started with something very simple. And I think in Italy, men kind of compete to cook. It's a competition. But I was taught to cook by my mom and dad, and cooking was about feeding the people. And I think it's really important when we talk about that, because I like to use very simple, basic ingredients. I'm not a trained chef. I never went to culinary school. I grew up in a kitchen. My mom and dad didn't have a lot of money. I was born in a pizza parlor in Newark, New Jersey. I grew up there. I tell a little story. One day, some woman walked into the pizza parlor. My mother was ringing, up customers, and she said, "How could you subject your children to this?" My brother and I were sleeping in the pizza parlor in the back, and there was it was a beautiful spring day, and it looked like pollen was floating in the air. "Your kids are going to have allergies," and I'm like, my mom tells me the story. I said, back then they were worried about allergies, and she knew different. It wasn't pollen floating in the air, it was pizza flour floating in the air. And it wasn't until I was about 6 or 7 that my mom told me it wasn't really cool to walk around with pizza flour in your hair and on your shoulders. They thought we had dandruff or something like that. But so I really grew up in the restaurant business. Today we brought this slicer with us, and the reason I bought the slicer is because many times we eat prosciutto, and we say we were in Italy or we were somewhere where we had a great slice of prosciutto, and all of prosciutto di Parma is good, San Daniele, great prosciuttos from Italy, but really this slicer is the magic. So a regular slicer slices about 1,000 rotations a minute, and it really cooks the meat that we're eating. This is hand cranked, so it has no motor, and I just crank it by hand, and it slices a slice per crank. So 1 rotation, 1 slice. So the prosciutto is very delicate and very fine, and today we just sliced 1 slice of prosciutto with a piece of toasted ciabatta, and I used a sponsor of our shows, but I think this olive oil is fantastic. It's Partana, it's from Sicily, very close to Trapani. And the olive oil is all Castelvetrano olive, so it's a single cultivar olive oil. If you feel some acidity in the olive oil, that's when olive oil is good, and you might feel a little bit of that. So we drizzled a little bit of the Sicilian olive oil on the plate, and the girls are handing that out now. And everybody seems a little, no one picked up their glasses yet. So that's unusual for us, at least. So pick up your glasses, get your palate wet. It's important that you smell the wine, you taste the wine, and then we get ready to eat the prosciutto with the ciabatta. That's good, right? On the table in front of you, there's a tasting mat with the name of the 2 wines that you're drinking, and there's also a tin kind of cardboard stock paper, and it has the recipe for the cingale, is the wild boar stew. And I'll tell you a little bit why I chose wild boar stew. These wines are made in Bolgheri, which is coastal Tuscany. And people don't understand that these vineyards are 10 kilometers, 12 kilometers from the sea. It's a unique place and microclimate to grow wines. but it's also unique for a few things. In Italy, they say kilometer zero, that we should eat and drink where we are, the place that we are. So if you go through the vineyards in Bulgari, and Axel and I spoke about it, and I've been there several times, there's wild boar that run through the vineyards and on the dirt roads. If you drive through the vineyards and the dirt roads and you don't see a wild boar, it's unusual. There's a lot of them. I had the opportunity to go with a fella, with my two sons. We loaded up an old Jeep with buckets of oats, these big plastic buckets of oats. We went to some clearing, 5 kilometers into the woods. It was a clearing twice the size of this room. And as the Jeep pulled in, the Cingale, the boar, knew the sound of the Jeep because they were going to get fed. And they heard the sound of the Jeep, and we got out, and you hear these crazy sounds. They grunt and groan, and we poured all the oats into a big pile. We took the buckets, we get back in the Jeep, and all of a sudden you see eyes, and you see fur, and you see Cingale, 5, 10, 25, 50, 60, 70 Cingale coming to feed. And they have to do this in Bulgari because there's so many of them that they ruin the vineyards. It looks like a tractor went through the vineyards if a couple wild boar run through your vineyards. So they do this, they feed them, and then once a year or twice a year, they control the species and they give them to the local butchers to help feed the poor. So it doesn't go to waste, but they need to control it. But this is what roams, where this wine grows. So I decided to cook a wild boar stew. So I'm going to step back here, and wild boar stew takes about 2 or 3 hours to cook, and we have 50 minutes. So I'm going to go quick, and then we have the wild boar stew finished, and we're going to serve it over a creamy polenta. So then you get to taste it, and I would definitely save some of the red wine, the Ornellaia 2010, to taste with the Cingale because I think it pairs really, really well. Okay. So, if you can't find Cingale, but if you go to a good butcher, you can get Cingale in New Jersey, New York. People will send it to you in the mail, dry packed with dry ice. And all I did was cut the Cingale into pieces. If you had venison, or if you had beef, or you had pork, or you had veal, you could do the same. The flavor of the wild boar is absolutely outstanding. I'm just going to take a little salt. Turn up my... I take a little salt, lots of pepper, maybe a little bit more salt, and I'm just kind of seasoning the beef, the Cingale, and then I would be remiss if I didn't put a little olive oil. 15-20 minutes of preparation and getting it in the pot. You can cook for 5, 10, 15 people very easily. Then you can relax. You can open a bottle of wine. You can put on the football game, the basketball game, whatever you're watching. So I take this, and then in this pan, it's like a 12-inch saute pan. I'm just going to start the Cingale. This is the point where I take off my blazer because I ruin one every single time. And what we do is we sear it to capture the flavor, to brown it on the outside, and then it goes into our stew. So this takes just a few minutes. You hear the sizzle, it's like medium heat. These are induction burners, so they're a little different than gas, but they work similar. You have that, you see up on the... So I just want to move this around so everything's brown on top. So I have carrots, onion, celery. I used about 2 pounds of meat, about 3/4 of a pound of the vegetables. I would have used a pound, but the bowls that I bought only held 3/4 of a pound. So about a pound of each of the vegetables. And next, as this browns, onions need to sweat. I think onions are the flavor of food, garlic and onions. We never want to overpower it, but you need to cook onions because they give food flavor. And I want them to become translucent. I want them to stick to the pan. I want them to create flavor with the meat. So again, it's part of what I'm going to do with the meat. So we don't want to rush this part. Okay, we have to sear the meat, we have to cook the onions. This is flavor. This is where flavor happens right here in this pan. Don't miss this step. Everybody rushes this step. Everybody that I see in America that cooks, take your time. This is an important step. It's one of the most important steps in making this stew right. Use good wine when you cook. I'm not a proponent of using cheap wine when you're cooking. You need to use good wine. So they call this deglazing. So I'm going to use a little of this wine. I'm going to deglaze the pan, get all of the char from the meat, the seasoning, the onion off the bottom. And you know you're cooking something good when you start to smell it, you start to salivate, and you say, I want to eat this now, I don't want to wait till it's over. So you start to smell it, you know, the flavors, it's coming together. I'm going to take all of the meat. This is the easy part. Celery, carrots. I took Italian tomato and I just broke them up with my hand. I took all the cores out of the tomatoes. Take the cores out of the tomatoes. Taste the tomatoes. Sometimes the tomatoes are very acidic. They're going to play a big part in how this tastes, so you don't want too much acidity in tomato. Buy good Italian tomatoes. Tomatoes. This is veal stock. We cooked it down, so we started with 20 gallons. We ended up with a gallon. It forms like a gel. Might be difficult. You can buy a beef stock, or maybe a good gourmet store has this in the freezer. We can buy, you know, a quart of it or whatever. But beef stock would work fine. You know, Kitchen Classics or one of those. Tomato paste. A little bit of tomato paste to thicken it. The rest of my red wine.
Apart from wild boar, we also grow a little bit of grapes, at least the ones that are left over from wild boar. As Victor very rightly said, Ornelas is a little bit of specific area, a specific winery, in a specific area, the one at Bolgheri. We're on the Tuscan coast, and it's actually quite a different landscape than most of Tuscany. It's radically different from the Chianti area or even Montalcino that are further inland. They tend to have a slightly more continental climate. It gets very hot during the day, cool during the nights. In Bolgheri, the closeness to the sea gives us sort of very mellow, mild weather. A lot of sunshine, because you do not have only the proverbial Tuscan sunshine, but also the sea acts as a little bit of reflector and really gives those beautiful evenings in August and particularly in September, where the sun really very slowly goes down, and up until late in the evening gives a lot of sunshine and allows the grapes to ripen under relatively mild temperatures, which is very important. And so it's no surprise, even if it might sound like this, that we do not grow Sangiovese, we do not grow the typical traditional Tuscan grapes, but the Bordeaux grape varietals, because they have found a second home in a way in Bolgheri, because this very mild climate and those soils with a high amount of clay, which are very favorable to Merlot, but also to Cabernet Sauvignon, when you have a little bit of pebbles with them. Those are really splendid conditions for those Bordeaux grape varietals, and that's what we produce our wines in. Ornelas is a blend out of Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot, the four dominant Bordeaux grape varietals, which we all grow on the estate. And the expression of Ornellaia wines and of Borghese wines in general, I would describe them as a sort of Mediterranean expression of those grape varieties. Obviously, you feel the sun, the ripeness, the opulence, which is something, the generosity, which is a sort of typically Italian feature. What's nice though, it's that our wines, I believe, are not only all about ripeness, they have a sort of distinctive freshness to them, just because there are elements that sort of temper the excess of Mediterranean climate, the slow cooling breezes that are coming from the sea, the freshness of the soils, because they're usually limestone and clay on very deep soils that hold back water quite well, and so there's always a little bit of moisture giving to the wines in the very dry growing seasons, and that sort of gives a perfect combination between that generosity, ripeness and opulence, and that freshness, which is important because we feel that above everything, it's that hint of freshness that really defines a great wine, and particularly defines a wine you want to have a second glass of, because you might be impressed very early on by an opulent, by a very flavorful wine. But in order to make you want to have a second glass, you have that need to have this sort of zippy freshness that really makes you salivate and makes you ready to have great food.
You know what I find interesting about this? It's very good drinking now. It's very young, but you can really enjoy it. The tannins are soft. What do you think about the ageability of the 2010 vintage?
I think, well, 2010 arguably is a rather specific vintage because it was one of the rather late ripening vintage and quite cool, so it's a relatively cool expression. If you'd had some of you were at the Ornellaia dinner yesterday, so we had side by side 2009 2010, which are sort of very opposite vintages. So 2009 was a much warmer year, you had all this sort of lushness and ripeness, and 2010 is certainly a little bit more restrained. It is true that this Italian generosity often makes our wines relatively approachable as young wines. They rarely really close completely down, they always maintain a lot of fruitfulness, a certain softness to them which makes them quite pleasurable when they're young. That being said, in our mind, they are definitely wines made for the long term and made for aging. Ornellaia is still a very young estate, so you might have seen that we had a specific bottle because with 2010 we celebrated the 25th vintage of Ornellaia, which is still, we're still in the Dollacin estate by the standards of European winemaking. So how long can our wines age? We're still trying to figure it out because the oldest wine, 1985, is still drinking quite well, which is quite astonishing given the fact that the first vineyards were only planted in 1982, so the vines were very young, and yet the wines have aged gracefully for 25, almost 30 years now. So definitely, I think for a great vintage Ornellaia, if you want to experience really the character of an aged wine, its complexity, its sort of seamless integration of all elements, you would give it between 8 to 15 years. That's my personal feeling when I feel the wines really start to peak. And obviously, once wines are peaking, they have this sort of plateau phase where for another 10 or 15 years they're capable of maintaining their qualities. How long the plateau phase is lasting for a wine, this is something we're still trying to observe once in a while, which gives us a good excuse to once in a while go into the wine library and pop an open.
What is the specific cuvee? How much oak and what type of cuvee are you?
In this particular case, being a full vintage, it has a slightly higher percentage of Merlot than usual. We're at about 55% Cabernet Sauvignon, which is always the dominating grape variety in Ornellaia, and close to 40% Merlot, and the rest would be Cabernet Franc and Verdot. There is new oak up to 2/3 usually, classically, and an aging for 18 months.
I would say I had the honor to be at a lunch with Axel on Friday, yesterday morning. Was that Friday? Yeah. Yesterday afternoon, and we tasted 01, 04, 06, 10 and 11. And 11. And really, you know, the evolution of wine is so important when we're learning about wine, when we're tasting wine. So if you get a chance, and oftentimes it's difficult, but if you can buy an older bottle with the newer vintage and taste them together, you really understand, and that's really how you learn about wine. Tony and I, Monday and Tuesdays, we taste a lot of wines, and people say, well, I read the wine book, I went online. But really, wine and food, you need to pour it in a glass, you need to taste it, you need to understand what happens in that evolution. And I mean, yesterday we had, you know, everybody at the table had a favorite, but clearly the wines were very, very young, vibrant, still, as Axel said, very, very fresh. And in my mind, the 01 had many more years to live and fill a glass and make, you know, happy people.
Axel, you spoke about Merlot being in the
Yeah.
blend. Can you tell us something about Merlot in general in your area, because it's become somewhat of a superstar?
Yes, definitely. It seems quite odd. Usually, Merlot does not fare too well in the very warm climates because it's a very gentle grape variety, but it's very easily affected by excessive heat and excessive drought. Yet Tuscany seems to be probably the only place today outside of Bordeaux and outside of the right bank of Bordeaux where Merlot can be really successful and occasionally really produce a profound wine, which is the most difficult thing to do with Merlot. Usually Merlot fares extremely well as a partner to other grape varieties. That's its main destination in most of the areas of the world, and it does this job extremely well because it's got a sort of very friendly, very soft character that sort of rounds out the angles of different grape varieties. Obviously, Cabernet Sauvignon in Bordeaux and in Bolgheri, but also Sangiovese, because it's become now in Tuscany a very, very common partner to Sangiovese, and it does this work of sort of slightly rounding out the slightly harsh angles which you can sometimes have with Sangiovese. And there are some places, and we know one very well, because apart from Ornelai we produce another wine which is called Masseto, which comes from a very specific vineyard in Bolgheri, very clay soils, in which we were able to really produce a wine out of Merlot that is sometimes compared to its very illustrious cousins, should I say, in Bordeaux. And there are a few other spots, arguably in Tuscany, that produce some really great Merlot. And yeah, it's probably this combination. You know, Italy and Tuscany, above all, is a sort of mountain right in the sea. So you always have some elements that temper the excessive climate, either because you're at higher elevation or because you're close to the sea. A lot of soils in Tuscany are clayish, which is something that Merlot definitely loves. And there are some places sprinkled all over Tuscany where you can produce world-class Merlot.
Just I don't know if any of you are familiar with Masseto, but it's really one of the best Merlots in the world compared to Chateau Petrus, etc. A little tip is look at the auction sites, because very often they have some older vintages of Masseto at ridiculously low prices. And even though Masseto has gone up in price, if you compare it to the big Pomerols, it's still, for the people who have this kind of money, you know, and drive Rolls Royces, or just crazy people like me that want to taste something that we can't afford. It's still a pretty good buy in comparison to the Pomerols. You know, it's still, you know, we're not encouraging you to raise your prices. And also, for the Ornelai, I'm happy that they make half bottles. I buy some half bottles, which is, to me, very Bordelaise. That's how I learned about Bordeaux wines, buying half bottles, because I couldn't afford the whole bottle.
Tony, I knew Masseto was getting very popular because all of a sudden I got my allocation of Masseto for the year, and you know, Paul called and he says you have X amount of cases, and the cases came in. I said, Paul, there's 3 bottles in the case. When was this a case of wine? A case of wine used to be 12, then it was 6, now it's 3. So Axel's wines have become very popular throughout the world, and they're absolutely fantastic wines that you're tasting. How about the white wine that we tasted today?
Yeah, that's a less obvious choice probably, even if Ornelai has always been producing white wines. Obviously the area is most renowned for its reds, and quite rightly so, because in order to produce great red wines you need a lot of sunshine. It's probably a bit less true for the whites, because in order to preserve that delicacy, the fragrance, it's usually better to have a very cool climate, which we don't necessarily have, but still after an initial phase where we produced a monovarietal Sauvignon Blanc, which we then temporarily decided to abandon to focus entirely on the reds, we're sort of feeling that you cannot just make red wine, first of all because eventually the winemaker winemaker gets a little bored always doing, you know, just red wine. So it's true that the white is a nice addition. It's also, we're probably getting bored in starting all our lunches and dinners just with red wine, so we definitely wanted a little bit of white wine in order to make sure we had an aperitif. We try to make it a little bit more than a distinguished aperitif. It's a wine that is, here again, we try to sort of get a Mediterranean twist on Sauvignon Blanc, which is the main grape variety for historical reasons that we use for this wine. We use some other grape varieties, Vermentino, which is a very typical local grape variety, and also Viognier, which is a grape variety that is present in this very wine. So you have about 93% of Sauvignon and 7% of Viognier, a percentage that is slightly rising, and from the 2013 vintage on also a little bit of Vermentino in order to make, yeah, again, a Mediterranean expression of this grape variety.
It's very good. I like it a lot. Very aromatic. And you know, bad Sauvignon leaves you with a very bad fragrance. It reminds you of going through the Roman Colosseum where all the tomcats live. But this has none of those grassy, over-the-top kinds of fragrances. Very aromatic, very fine.
Does anyone have any questions?
I know about the polenta. What did you use as the stock for that?
We just use water.
Just water?
You know, traditionally you can use water, you can use vegetable stock. We had lunch yesterday and I spoke to the chef and I said, "Chef, this is the creamiest polenta I've ever tasted." And he said, "I made it very traditional style." I said, "Well, give me a couple hints. What did you do?" And he said, "Well, I started with 2/3 water and 1/3 heavy cream." I said, "Well, that's not really traditional." He said, "It made good polenta though." And then I said, "What did you do after that?" He said, "I added some pullover, which is French butter, olive oil, and Parmesan cheese, and I put it in the blender." And as I finished mine, and I'm tasting this polenta, and I'm like, wow, I've never tasted polenta like this before in my whole life, because, again, I was taught by my mom and dad, we cook very basic, you know, we cook to feed the people, to put a plate on your table that you would enjoy. And I did enjoy his polenta, but it's much different than the polenta that I make. So we just use salt, pepper, water, polenta.
Well, we sometimes tend to forget, probably, we should mention that the chef actually who cooked for us yesterday was from Bergamo, northern Italy. And obviously with the fashion of Mediterranean diet, we sometimes forget that somehow Italy is divided into two parts. The more central and southern part is all about olive oil, vegetables, and few dairy products. And northern Italy can be surprisingly rich because they will use cream, cheese, butter to cook everything. Obviously, you're already in continental Europe, you're close to the Alps. Sometimes it's not Mediterranean at all, but that can be, especially around Bergamo, you're getting into some very, very dark valleys. Valtellina would be one of those valleys that almost doesn't get any sunshine, so people seem to be quite depressed, and they sort of cure themselves by eating very rich polenta with a lot of cheese and a lot of cream and a lot of butter.
Tony and I were in northern Italy, and we were guests of a winery in northern Italy, and we sat down to the table, and there was a bottle of wine in a wine bucket. So we pulled the wine out of the wine bucket, and we drank red wine with our first course. It was Schiava that was chilled. And then we drank white wines with the butter, the sage, the canoodle, the dumplings. And totally opposite than you might think in experience. So Italy, for us, you know, Tony always says we'll never run out of material to shoot in Italy, because it's a country that's made up of 20 regions that is so diverse from north to south. So in the north we have blonde, blue-eyed people. They speak German as their first language. You know, I think I'm doing good. Tony says, I asked Tony a couple hints on my Italian. I asked a question in Italian, and they respond in German. Axel wasn't there. I'm in deep water. I mean, so they respond in German because until the World War, part of that was Germany and Austria. So, and then we move down the boot. We go all the way to the south. Sicily is 150 miles off the coast of Africa. We have very dark-skinned people. They have a dialect that in Northern Italy they might not understand. The food, the people, everybody looks different. And that diversity in Italy is really what draws Tony and I back. And people have responded. They said, we want to see this on TV. We want to see what you bring to television, because we go to places, we could visit Axel, or Axel has a friend that cooks, in a kitchen throughout Italy. We have these opportunities to go places where most of us couldn't go if we didn't have a camera on our shoulder and a microphone and promise them that they were going to be on television in America. So we have a lot of doors open for us, and we go to a lot of places, and we thank our viewers, because it's been a great time eating and drinking.
And Tony, how many varietals are there in Italy?
Oh, I would say probably there are several hundred. I read 400, I read 700 registered with the European Union,
Right.
but there are many more in addition to that. So
Right.
I would say maybe 1,000 or
Yeah.
1,000.
Yes, because within a good example would be Sangiovese. If you go to several places of Tuscany, you'll find that more or less the same grape variety split into subspecies that all have different names. Obviously, in Montalcino it's called Brunello. If you go to Montepulciano, it's got yet another name. You have very many different names, because it seems that every single part of Tuscany has sort of bred their own type of Sangiovese. So even within known grape varieties, you have several subspecies. So it's incredibly variable, and we don't really know them well enough, because they've been there all the time, but people have mostly not really focused on them. Even Sangiovese, it used to be a grape variety out of which people would make fairly easy quaffing wines. Chianti would not necessarily be a very ambitious wine, and it took the revolution of the Super Tuscans to get people really try to work very thoroughly on Sangiovese. Now we're discovering that it's capable of making some of the greatest wines in the world. And there are loads of examples. One can think of Aglianico in southern Italy, an incredible grape variety that is grown on the Mount Etna, which is Nerello Mascalese, which seems to be a sort of Sicilian version of Pinot Noir. So it's really incredible how many different grape varietals there are in Italy. But since the Italians like always to do a little competition with the French and try to beat the French whenever they can, they sort of thought, we've got a lot of grape varietals, but in order to make sure that we beat them in terms of really amount of grape varietals, we're not only growing ours, we're taking theirs too.
Everything grows in Italy.
Yeah, that's right.
And you really have to operate on a very local level. Vic mentioned 20 regions, which are like our states, but even within regions, not only for wines, but also for foods, there's variation. I like to say Italy changes every 10 kilometers. But if you go to Piemonte, which people are familiar with, in southern Piemonte, they eat pasta, they eat tagliolini, they eat agnolotti, little stuffed pastas. If you go to northern Italy, that's where they have risottos. And you don't see that much of a crossover, although great things like that have become really all Italian. Like if you go to fine restaurants, places a little more cosmopolitan, you may see something beyond local dishes.